Good afternoon and welcome to this ZC3 Thought Leaders webinar. For those new to this format, these are regular, typically monthly online events hosted by Mobility Ways to share and discuss transport decarbonisation topics. For those new to Mobility Ways, we are a leader in transport decarbonisation and the leader in tackling emissions from employee commuting, which, as a Scope 3 category, accounts for around 5% of the UK's total carbon footprint. Through our comprehensive Measure, Reduce, Report framework, we are empowering organisations to understand the potential for sustainable commuting within their workforce, from which data-driven strategies delivering operational and environmental impact can be devised. My name is Graham Bannister, and I lead Mobility Ways interactions with UK councils and authorities, hence the reason I'm chairing today's session. Today, we shall be exploring net zero transition through a council lens, specifically reflecting on progress towards net zero as assessed by Climate Emergency UK, who published their findings, Climate Action Scorecards, in October. I'm joined today by Isaac Beaver from Climate Emergency UK, who will provide details on their work, the methodology underpinning the analysis, plus then in keeping with the theme of these webinars, a deeper dive into progress on transport decarbonisation. Isaac will be presenting for around half an hour, which will leave about the same amount of time for questions. So please, as Isaac is presenting, do drop questions into the Q&A function. Isaac, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks so much to Mobility Ways as well for giving us this opportunity to speak to you today, and we really appreciate any opportunity we're given. So yeah, I'm Isaac Beaver. I'm co-director of Climate Emergency UK, and I'm here to talk about the council transition to net zero. Next slide. So just a little bit about Climate Emergency UK and who we are. We were founded in 2019 by Councillor Kevin Freyer, who at the time wanted to encourage councils to declare climate emergencies. And how we did that was through collating climate emergency declarations and the model motions. We then went on to work with our key partners, My Society, and collated all the climate emergency action plans and strategies that councils then released following their declarations. And then we published the scorecards, and that's our project that I'm talking about today. So we first published the climate plan scorecards, which then assessed UK councils' climate action plans in January 2022. And obviously we started marking the council climate action scorecards in January 2023 and published that, as Graham mentioned, in October this year. And how we think of ourselves is sitting at the intersection between kind of councils and residents and campaigners, because what we want to do is equip the council climate movement with the information and guidance needed for structural change and accelerating the work of local campaigns for climate action. Next slide. Just a little bit really quickly on the case for action. The Climate Change Committee says that local authorities have powers to influence over a third of UK emissions in their locality. Some studies have said it's up to 80% of UK emissions in their locality. We know residents and of the UK are concerned about climate change and want action. And we know that councils have shown that willingness as well. 83% of UK councils have declared a climate emergency since 2019, and a very similar percentage have actually released climate action plans. And we firmly believe that change can happen locally, and whether that's through the groundbreaking planning policies that have come forward recently from places like Cornwall, Bath, Leeds or Lancaster or Central Lincolnshire, that's going further and faster than the national government is. So we firmly believe that change can happen locally, and that's why we're working at this level to try and encourage local climate action. Next slide. Cool, and our mission is to inform residents and increase understanding of local climate action, and provide a benchmark for council climate action, and show councils where they can improve, and encourage further support for councils from the national and the UK government. Next slide. And just a little bit about how we see our climate action scorecards, and obviously I'll delve more into more details on the project later. But we have assessed every UK council on their climate action. And we see our two main audiences as campaigners, residents, and councils. So we see campaigners using the scorecards to identify demands, lobbying for those specific and targeted policy improvements, and trying to win local changes. Councils using those scorecard results to identify best practice. Hopefully that then leads to improving current climate action plans and implementing more effective policies. And Climate Emergency UK obviously promote the scorecard results, but also demand more support, as I said, for local climate action from the UK and devolved governments. And then all of that we hope leads to a reduction in emissions, especially at the local level. Next slide. So a little bit about our methodology. What did we mark and assess? Next slide. So the action scorecards, one of the main things that's really special about the scorecards is that we don't just assess the really specific actions, say like decarbonising a building or instituting school streets program, but we look at things like the governance and finance of that local authority. You know, do they have a cabinet climate lead, for example? We look at the collaboration engagement of that local authority on climate, biodiversity, waste reduction, food, planning, land use, transport, buildings and heating. So we've marked climate action across these 7 sections, and we have 91 questions across all of those 7 sections. Next slide. Where does our data come from? So what's another thing that we think is really special about the scorecards is that it's probably one of the largest citizen data projects in the UK. The volunteer research is actually allows for us to compile to answer 2/3 of those questions. So we use volunteer research to answer 2/3 of those questions, and then the final third is split between what we call national data and freedom of information requests. So we sent freedom of information requests to answer about 1/6 of questions in the scorecards, and national data was used to answer the other 6th. And how we define national data is obviously data that's from the government, such as the bus ridership data per capita, or data from national campaign orgs, such as 20 is Plenty, who already compile a list of all the local authorities who have 20 mile an hour as the default speed limit. Next slide. So a little bit about our timeline and process. So we released our methodology actually last year in November 2022, and that's when we published the methodology for the action scorecards. And that was a process from April to November of a lot of consultation, a lot of research, and a lot of developing this the methodology. We spoke to around 90 individuals and groups who are experts in each of those different areas, and including council officers and councillors in each of the sections. We had an advisory group that also represented the local climate sector, including 2 council officers, 2 councillors, former volunteers and campaigners, but also people from environment NGOs as well. And they oversaw the methodology and the creation of the methodology. So after publishing our methodology in November, we actually started the first mark from January, February time, which we did the first mark with volunteers. We then will go into a right of reply period and a scoring audit. So we use this 3-stage process of the first mark, right of reply, and scoring audit to try and ensure consistency and accuracy of the results. So the first mark is where the majority of people get involved in the scorecards process. So we actually had over 200 volunteers get involved to help do the quite unsexy work of trawling through council climate council minutes or climate action plans or action plan updates to try and find the information to answer the questions. We then go through a right of reply period, which is where we send that first mark to councils so they can challenge and provide any feedback or provide information that we may have missed. What was really incredible for us is that we had 74% of UK councils actually respond in the right of reply, with the vast majority of those responding to 50% or more questions. So that's really, really high engagement, and we're really proud of that as well. I'm really thankful for the councils for for responding in that way. We then go through a scoring audit, and that audit is there to, as I said, ensure accuracy and consistency of marking. We use a much smaller team of volunteers and staff to actually look at the first mark, look at the right of reply, and award that the actual marks that you see that are live on the website today. And of course, we launched the scorecards in October this year. And next slide. Cool. And just to say, we're very transparent as an organization. So a lot of this information you can find on our methodology webpage, including what we've marked, the development of the scoring system, the presentation of the data, weighting of questions, scoring process, scoring system question criteria. All of that in more detail is available on our website. And next slide. Cool. So just a little bit about the impact so far, and then I'll talk a bit more about the results. So if you go on to the next slide. So our impact so far, we've had over 220 media hits since launch, which is really incredible for us. We had an exclusive in the Financial Times on the postcode lottery for social homes, over 53,000 website users in the first month, data quoted in the Green Jobs Foundation report. We've had councils representing our work, speaking at things like the County Council Network Conference, and webinars like today. Our plan scorecards were previously quoted in the Skidmore Review. It's been quoted multiple times by the Climate Change Committee, the Scottish Accounts Commission, and others. Next slide. Cool. So probably what you were interested in from joining this webinar is a bit more about the results. So just going to go into that now. And on the next slide, we have just generally that councils are scoring low. And you can see there's an average score per council type. And it's just important to mention that we split councils out by council type because obviously they have different powers. So a district authority is marked against less questions in the transport section because they're not a transport authority, whereas a county council is marked against less questions in the planning section because they are only a planning authority when it comes to minerals and waste. So that's why we have the different types of council. And just to explain single tier, that includes the London boroughs, unitaries, metropolitan districts, Scottish and Welsh councils. So as you can see, the average score across those different areas was around, did vary, but was around 30%. And you can see Northern Ireland was the lowest of the different council types, so 21%, and the combined authorities generally scored a little higher. Again, that methodology is slightly different due to their powers as well. But you can see the ranges were kind of similar. So single tier, the range went from 9% as the lowest score all the way up to 62%, very similar for district, again, very similar for county councils and similar for combined authorities as well. Go on to the next slide. And the average scores per nation also varied. So Scotland was, by average, was the highest scoring nation on 34%, England on 32%, Wales on 30%, and as I said, Northern Ireland on 21%. Next slide. And those scores also varied by English region. So this is something that's also really interesting. London obviously was the highest scoring English region, with the Northeast one of the lowest scoring English region. You can see, even if you remove London out of that, you can still see there's quite a big discrepancy between some of those higher scoring regions like the Southwest and the Northeast as well. Just to mention at this stage, we have got a research report coming out in next year with our research partners and thesis, looking at some of these trends and why that may have occurred. Something that came up in the plan scorecards, though, is that the indices of multiple deprivation, there was a general trend that councils that scored higher were obviously less deprived in the plan scorecards, that councils that scored lower, generally, you can see there was a trend between areas that were more deprived scoring lower. And it could be that that trend is replicated in the action scorecards too. Next slide. And the results vary per section. There are 41 UK councils who score over 50%, with the highest scores in the low 60% range. But what we did see is councils are able to score over 80% in those sections, in a lot of our sections. So there are councils that scored over 80% in buildings and heatings, collaboration engagement, waste reduction and food, and planning and land use. For example, Leeds scored 92% in the planning and land use section. So it does show that it is possible for local authorities to score really highly, but just across the board. And there are, as I said, there are councils that are scoring really highly in certain sections, but just across the board, the scoring is generally low. Cool, next slide. The transport results as well, it was the second lowest scoring section. And I think part of that is because the transport section contains the most negatively scored questions. So in this year's scorecards, we had questions that were negatively scored because of if the council took that action, such as the expanding of roads, road capacity, or the expansion of airports, it has a negative effect on emissions in the sense that it drives emissions up. So you can see that the results across the average scores in transport were far lower than the average scores seen overall. So you can see single tiers council scored an average of 22%, with combined authorities scoring slightly higher on 41%, again, with a slightly different methodology to the other councils. You can also see that range is very different as well, with the highest scoring councils around around 70%, but some of the lowest scoring councils actually scoring negative marks, as I said, because of that questions around road building or airport expansion, and also negative questions around air quality that did not meet the World Health Organization's guidelines. And next slide. So just to talk a little bit about the state of affairs and kind of the overall, some of the big statistics that we saw within the transport section. And going on to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the main things is we need to stop increasing emissions from the transport sector. I am from Luton, that is my hometown, which is why I've put it on there and don't feel any. But Luton Airport was at expanded capacity by 1 million passengers. That's more flights, that's more emissions. And also big roads and improving big roads, such as the one in, I believe it's Wiltshire Council, that approved, that is the planning authority that approved the work around the Stonehenge. And also, obviously, I know that some of that is through the national highways as well. But there's a lot of councils that have approved extra road capacity and other extra roads building as well, which obviously sends emissions up. And the first thing would be to stop doing is stop committing harm or stop sending emissions up. Next slide. There are signs of change. Obviously, we've seen what's happened in Wales with the moratorium on road building, and the future, what the Welsh government has released in terms of the future Welsh road building tests, in the sense that future road investment for projects that help reduce carbon emissions and support a shift to public transport, walking or cycling, adapt to the impacts of climate change, improve safety through small scale changes. I think that's the kind of thing that a lot of people that work in this in decarbonising transport would love to see rolled out across the UK. Next slide. Some of the headline stats that came out from the Council Climate Action Scorecards in the transport section was only 19% of councils have EVs as over 10% of their fleet or more, which for me was a really low percentage. That is only 19% of councils, as I said, have over 10% of their fleet or more. So for me, that was actually quite shocking to see that councils hadn't maybe moved further on with changing their fleet to be more electric. Next slide. Only 8% of councils have more than 30 school streets. And I was really encouraged to see that school streets are starting to spread more across the country and out of the urban areas. There are school streets happening on a trial in Somerset, in the town of Frome. And there are school streets happening in smaller urban areas across the country as well. But it's still that only 8% of councils have more than 30 school streets. Next slide. Bus decarbonisation has started. I would say there is slow progress. We've seen multiple areas, including obviously London leading for quite a while, Nottingham and Reading and Brighton too, with electric buses. But we've started to see deliveries of places in Scotland as well, and obviously Greater Manchester, which has come out with a big order for electric buses and improvement of that across their area. And next slide. Something that we found from the combined authorities, though, which is really interesting, is that apart from Tees Valley, they all had a target to decarbonise their bus fleet. West Midlands, West of England, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough were 2030. GLA was 2034, Liverpool City Region, North East and North Tyne was 2035, and you can see the various targets there. I'm sure that bus decarbonisation, it's really encouraging that it started, and it's really good that there's these targets, but progress is likely slower than is needed to reach these targets. And that, you know, I'll get onto a couple of those reasons why later on in this presentation. Next slide. Only according to the government, with the bus ridership per capita, you know, it's only really London, Brighton, Nottingham, Reading that have good bus use in this country, and that was down to you can see the exact metrics and methodology on our site, but it's quite again, the London area obviously included multiple councils, but for outside of London, for only 3 local authorities to have really decent bus use is quite low as well. Next slide. And only 9 London boroughs have residents parking permits across their whole area. So this is Camden, which zones its residents parking permits. And I'll get onto the importance of parking for decarbonisation later on into that. There's only 9 London boroughs that have residents parking permits across their whole area. Next slide. And I think the area that's probably seen the greatest improvement is with public EV charging. I don't think that would be a shock because I think that's had the longest term funding of any transport area and the most funding for any transport area in the last few years. And it's also, I think, one of the best funding pots in the sense that it's one of the most easily accessible for local authorities to be able to bid and provide public EV charging. So yeah, next slide. A little bit about what I think will bring about change. It's talking about some of those statistics and headlines that we saw in the scorecards, but what I think will actually bring about some of that change. So next slide. Councils need to utilize their powers. Part of the thing that we see in the scorecards is we do think councils can do more. We do think councils can go further. We also totally realise that councils are massively hampered by the national government, and I'll get onto some of that later. But councils do need to utilise those powers. Lewisham has one of the most expansive school streets programme in London, with about 50 schools that have school streets, which is one of the highest in the country. But for example, Hammersmith and Fulham have no school streets at this time. Manchester only has 7. My hometown of Luton, I think, only has 4. And there's no reason why there should be such a discrepancy between somewhere in Hammersmith and Fulham, a very dense urban area that has no school streets, and Lewisham that has over 50. Like, we should be prioritising and looking to push school streets in every local authority area because they can work in small market towns. They can work in places like Frome. They can work in like bigger towns like Luton or places like Ipswich, and they can obviously work in our big major cities as well. So councils need to be pushing forward and utilising their powers when it comes to decarbonising transport. Next slide. Councils need to view parking powers as key to decarbonisation. And there was a study that was published in the Conversation that looked at 700 other studies on decarbonisation initiatives, and it ranked the most effective decarbonisation initiatives across all of Europe. And this study showed in the top 5 out of the 10, in the top 5 out of those 10 actions that were collated by this study, parking was in 2 of those top 5. So whether that was having something like a workplace parking levy, so using their parking powers to stop lower commuting, such as in Nottingham, or using parking permits from residents, parking permits to stop travel or to limit travel or discourage travel between areas within boroughs and across parts of areas between boroughs or different council areas as well. So for example, I actually live in South London, so this is something that's coming up at the moment. Both Lewisham and Southwark are expanding their control parking access zones for residents across their areas. Obviously, it is a controversial topic, but it is key to decarbonisation because it discourages short trips, because people can't, by taking away free parking, people are more likely to walk, cycle, or take public transport for those short trips, which we know is a major contributor to poor air quality and also to emissions from transport. And it also discourages trips between towns as well, which in like regional, people, if they can't find that free parking, are more likely to take public transport, walk or cycle across that as well. So councils need to view parking powers as key to decarbonise. There's also another key action here, which we didn't include within the scorecards, but has been done. For example, Lewisham and a few other councils have instituted higher prices on parking for fossil fuel cars as a way to encourage people to take up EVs as well. And that's another key thing that nudges people towards EV take up. Cool. Next slide. Councils need to not back down. These things will be controversial. I'll get on to that and on the next slide as well. But Leicester had proposed a workplace parking levy, and Oxford and Bristol have in the works things around a workplace parking levy. When it came down to it, Leicester actually scrapped that, which is a real shame. I think it would have been really effective. It's been seen to be really effective in Nottingham and in other places around Europe. So councils need to utilise their powers. They need to use their parking powers and other powers they have over transport, and then not back down when things get tough. Next slide. And just to give a shout out to Possible and also Professor Goodwin, the reason why is that because new schemes will likely follow what's known as this Goodwin curve. Professor Goodwin studied road pricing schemes and suggested this kind of gestation process for road pricing schemes. And this kind of shows that, you know, you have a new idea, public support is quite low, and public support slowly builds. But just before and just around the implementation of the schemes, there's a lot of panic, controversy, criticism. And yet what happens after, and that's the same for school streets, that's the same for low traffic neighborhoods, that's the same for clean air zones, and that's the same for things like workplace parking levy. What happens after the implementation is people start to see the co-benefits, they start to see the co-benefits of the action that's being taken, but also that the action isn't necessarily negatively affecting their lives as much as they maybe thought. Public support again goes up. You know, we don't see anyone calling for the congestion charge in London to be scrapped. We don't see anyone in Nottingham calling for the workplace parking levy to be scrapped. After a few years and of people getting used to this, public support goes up and these things become normal. So it is very likely that schemes, and you can see it whether it's in schemes that have happened more recently, or if you go to schemes that happened a few decades ago, that this idea, this panic before implementation and afterwards, it's not seen as big a deal. And yeah, thank you to Possible for routinely flagging this as well. And as, yeah, next slide. And we can also give back. A lot of what I've talked about is often viewed as things that are taking away from people. You know, you're removing free parking, or you're making it more difficult to drive, or etc. But we can give back with shared mobility, and that includes things like car sharing, bike hire, bike sharing. That includes things like hiring e-scooters. That includes things like rental e-mopeds as part of schemes like Wheels to Work, or includes things like mobility ways lift share schemes that are working across the country as well. It's not always about viewing things as taken away, but it's also about giving back in the sense that you can have the freedom to use a car if there's good car sharing schemes, as there are in London and starting to progress around the country as well. And this, the information on those shared mobility I got from Coordinated Como UK, which is the body that represents and oversees shared mobility work. So next slide. And it's also about giving back in the sense of the co-benefits these new schemes will bring. This was in the original Greater Manchester Combined Authorities B Network report that they did. And it showed the difference that if more people cycle, the difference that it makes to health, the difference that it makes to the air pollution, the difference that it would make to congestion and time spent commuting, the difference that it would make to safety in the terms of the number of people killed, so or injured on our roads. So it just goes to show that, you know, the path that we're on at the moment and the society that we have at the moment, which is quite car centric, at the moment does have lots of negative effects, which could, when we decarbonize transport, we remove a lot of those negative effects as well. We improve air quality, we improve health outcomes, we improve safety on our roads, we limit traffic congestion, and we which I think is just some of the co-benefits that are often talked about when flagged, when transport decarbonisation initiatives come up, but are really important to keep emphasising that it's not just about taking away, for say, free parking, it's also about giving back space. And one of the best examples of that, just to flag it, is Lambeth's curbside strategy, which is the council talking about using the curbside to create public space, whether that's through things like benches, street trees, instead of just, or bike parking instead of just being car parking on the curbs. Next slide. The other key things that will happen, that will need to happen for transport decarbonisation, is obviously long-term committed funding from the government. That is one of the key things that we know will unlock and will create a lot more decarbonisation for transport. So obviously this is from Sir Strands, who led the campaign on the active travel funding that was cut by the government recently. That is obviously that would have been released through Active Travel England, and their budget was cut from 300 million down to, I think, 100 million. was a real shame because the funding needs to be there. It needs to be long term. It needs to be in place, and it needs to crucially be non-competitive for it to be effective and for it to work. And I think the work that Active Travel England did in terms of their capability assessments was really positive, and it was framed really positively in helping councils get better. Unfortunately, the government then needs to back that up by making sure that the funding is provided, adequate funding is provided, long-term, non-competitive, so that councils can introduce these decarbonisation initiatives. Next slide. And also air quality legal limits need to be reduced. I know that there are new targets for air quality, but they're set to be reduced, I believe, by 2040. I still think even by that date, a lot more councils will be caught out by that reduction because there's still a lot of councils that are breaking the current legal limits. But Wales is actually in its environment bill for 2023 is actually looking at requiring councils to set targets which take into account the WHO guidelines on air quality, which from my understanding, the WHO guidelines are about 4 times lower for PM 2.5 than the current legal limits. And for NO2, I think it's roughly about the same. And so we need air quality legal limits to be reduced as well. And while obviously that will improve air quality, it will also drive decarbonisation because they are so intrinsically linked together. Next slide. Oh, that is the end. I just wanted to have some things just to flag as well. So I've talked a little bit about the Council Climate Action Scorecards, which is the first ever kind of holistic assessment of all UK councils against their local climate action. All of that information is available online on councilclimatescorecards.uk. I've also talked a little bit about some of the headline stats that have come out in terms of their general scoring, but also their scoring in the transport section, with some of those stats for specific questions as well. All of that you can find online. At Climate Emergency UK, we also supply all of the data and information is publicly available, but if you want to do more work with that data and information, you can buy the data in a spreadsheet format. You can find out the prices to buy all of that data in a spreadsheet format on our website. And we're also open to doing consultancy work. If that's you ever wanted data collected on local climate action, we'd be happy to compile that for you. We're pretty good at compiling data on local climate action now. And we also provide services to councils and residents, whether that's through training, providing training sessions specific to that council or specific to that local area, or whether that's providing specific consultancy services for councils as well. So I hope that was interesting and useful, a bit of background on Climate UK and the scorecards. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions there have been as well. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Isaac. Really thought-provoking. There are questions coming through. Please add some more. I'll let some more come through in the next couple of minutes, and I'll just start off with a couple if I may. I was looking at the range of the transport scores, Isaac, and obviously noting some negative scores. Can you talk a little bit more about the transport question set? I think there was 12 or maybe 14 questions, and particularly where penalty marks are applied, leading to negative scores.
Yeah,
just a little bit more of framing that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the questions in our transport section, so one of the ones is obviously around the EV fleet of councils, school streets, clean air zones, workplace parking levy, residence parking permits, bus ridership, whether there's low emission buses used in the area, and a few of the other ones I can't remember off the top of my head. But for the negative questions, there's one negative question which asks whether the council has expanded road capacity in their area. So that's approved new roads or expanded capacity. And it is a nuanced methodology in the sense that we're not just asking for where there's like a small road that's connected development to a bigger road. We're asking for bigger schemes than that, because we recognize that houses need roads to go around as well, obviously. And expansion of airports, so that was either through building new runways or expanding passenger output. And so that was a negative question. And then we had negative questions split out on air quality, whether that the council in that area had a significant number of neighbourhoods that broke the WHO guidelines on for PM 2.5, and the other question was a significant number of neighbourhoods that broke the WHO guidelines for NO2 as well. So yeah, those were our negative questions. And the reason why we included that is obviously, councils, can take action that do reduce emissions, and are taking action is reducing emissions. But at the same time, if they're building a huge new road, which is for the next, which has embodied emissions through the building of it, but also for the next 20 years is going to be driven down by a lot of fossil fuel cars, it's going to negatively impact emissions as well. And what we need to do is not look at expanding road capacity in this country, but look at improving public transport, particularly for regional trips, and improving walking and cycling and public transport in our towns and our urban areas and villages as well, where most people live.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and just I guess a little bit of a follow-up. So I think you defined them as like high carbon transport projects.
That's right.
The question. So I guess if a scheme is part of the national agenda, should the council be penalised, or was there some element of weighting towards that to reflect the fact that it's something that is not fully in their control as such?
Yeah, so we would only penalise a council if they're the planning authority for that scheme. So if they are the planning authority for that scheme and they've approved it, whether it's in the national agenda or not, then they would receive negative marks. I think we didn't come across this, but if the council had not approved the scheme, it had been called in and been approved by the national government, we would not have negative marks for that question, because obviously the council has basically done its utmost to not have something that harms the environment, and then the government has overridden that. So I think there's an example. We have another planning question which asks about high carbon infrastructure in terms of coal, oil, or gas. And I think in Lincolnshire, the council said no to some new gas work recently, and the government overrode that. I don't think we would negatively mark the council for that, because they've used their powers to not actively increase emissions, but the government's overridden them. So where the council is the planning authority, and they have approved, say, new roads or the expansion of airports, we would mark them negatively. If the government was to come in and override that, override those powers, I don't think we would.
Okay, fabulous. Right, I'm looking into the questions now. So 3 from Chenil Wright, which I think we've answered a couple of them. How do we access the full data set, and is there a full report? I think you touched on that already. One here actually: how often are the scorecards updated? I'm assuming, is this going to be an ongoing activity now?
Yeah. Well, so our mantra is you can't change what you don't measure, and the idea is to repeat the scorecards process again. So we released the plan scorecards in January, as I said, January 2022. The action scorecards in October 2023. We're currently deciding when we should run these scorecards again, based on a few different factors. One is the pace of change, whether it is likely that councils would have changed quick enough for that data to be updated, and also the effort it takes to just run this project, and the amount of funding and resources and all of that volunteer time as well that we need to run that project. So we're currently decided that it will run again in 2025. We haven't decided when in 2025 yet, but we thought 2 years from the launch would give a decent enough time for projects and things to have moved forward, but also a good enough time so that the data is hopefully still relevant and still comparable, and also gives us time to reflect, review the methodology, and also hopefully go out and engage communities and councils on the scorecards as well. So yes, it will be repeated again. We're currently planning for 2025.
2025, great stuff. And there was a question here about what period did the scorecards assess? So obviously to the point that you've got today, and obviously now thinking 2 years ahead. But yeah, how far back are you looking, or how does that?
That's a really good question, actually. I probably should have covered that. So thank you for who asked it. We looked from 2019 onwards up until April 2023. So obviously we have to have a cutoff date, because otherwise we'd be consistently changing information and data right up until the launch. So for the first scorecards, we looked from 2019 from up until April 2023. The reason for that 2019 date is because the majority of councils started declaring emergencies and climate emergencies from that date. So we thought it was fair to mark from then. The other thing just to flag though is obviously Nottingham, for example, has had its workplace parking levy in place for about a decade. What we were currently asking, what we were asking for that question is, do you currently have a workplace parking levy? Yes, like Nottingham currently has a workplace parking levy, so we're giving them positive points. We're not going to say, oh, because you started this school streets program in 2015, those don't count anymore. We're asking about, for some of the questions, we're asking about how many do you currently have? And so that could have been, they currently have 50 because they've been going for it from 2015, or they've got, 15 because they've only been going for it from 2021. So we looked from 2019 to 2023, but obviously some of that is a build up from historical projects as well, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think so.
Cool.
A question, I think you actually covered it in the sense that you said you were doing some additional research. There was a question around how do the council scorecards address the fact that different councils have different budgets? I think you reflected in the presentation that there were perhaps wealthier councils that were doing better. There was generally a sort of an aspect within there. Is ultimately is it a fair comparison?
That's a great question. And that's a really difficult one to ask as well. We do think that all of the questions that we ask for those particular authorities are actions that authorities can take. We do also recognise that local councils have been hit with austerity for the last decade, and that is increasingly more difficult to do for them because of climate is a discretionary spend, and the majority of councils' budgets are now taken up with things like social care. It would be interesting to see where councils that are richer or their communities don't have as much deprivation, whether they score higher in different sections. I think that's something that we could particularly look at in the research report that's coming out. And it's but I think there's a lot of things, so for example, in planning policy and in governance and collaboration, which maybe don't require the same level of funding and input, and a lot of councils can do, as long as they work and look at who are some of those pioneer councils that are doing this work and kind of just copy and implement and use some of the information, say from the scorecards, to help improve those policies. So I think there will always but council budgets and even the wealth of the communities will unfortunately have an effect on the general trends within the scorecard results. But I do think it's a fair comparison because we do think councils can take the action that we've asked for.
And I guess also within your scoring, you're also then weighting against like single tier and district, etc. You're sort of pulling out some of the questions which aren't so relevant for.
Yeah, exactly. So that's partly of the council list. We know districts tend to be on the whole obviously a lot smaller than single tier unitary authorities. So by comparing districts only to districts and against those questions, obviously where they have the powers as well, it's a fairer comparison because often those councils are a lot smaller than single tier anyway.
Yes. So 2025 for the next one. Do you envisage planning that you'll stick with the current question set? Is there anything that was close to the list for this one which you're thinking you might put in for next time?
I think we want to stick with the methodology as much as possible so that the data is comparable. I do think that we would like to make a few tweaks to some of the questions. So whether that's including things like a higher limit in terms of, say, for example, the EV fleet question, we only ask councils if they have over 10% of or more of their fleet as EVs. I think it's a question there that we might like to set a higher limit as well to show some progression as well. So maybe like 50% is a higher limit as an example of a change we might make. So we do want to keep the methodology as consistent as possible so that the data is comparable, but we also recognize that we do need to make some changes. We do need to make some tweaks to kind of improve the methodology as we go, because obviously no project is perfect, and we do recognize that and want to make those changes as we go as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of, I'd say fair questions. Obviously, you're showcasing this, and we're talking primarily to a council audience today. To what degree are you sort of lobbying above that? Let's say onto national government,
definitely
authorities, because I think there is obviously, You
Yeah,
say austerity, funding crises, etc. Councils
yeah,
that want to do stuff and are struggling to get stuff across the
yeah.
line.
Yeah, absolutely, and Chris Skidmore actually recognised it as well when he said there's a lot of local, regional, and community will to decarbonise or reach net zero, but too often the government gets in the way. And I think one of the major barriers to local climate action is the government, whether that's through particularly through the lack of funding that's available, and the fact that it's short-term competitive funding pots often for these schemes as well, which I just think is so detrimental and actually enforces inequality and enforces that fact that smaller councils and are more likely to lose out compared to bigger ones because they're able to have the team to bid. In terms of the work that we do, we are part of the Blueprint Coalition, which is an influential coalition of different groups such as Ashton, Adept, Friends of the Earth, PCAN, Grantham Institute. So a mix of kind of campaign organizations, sector organizations, and research organizations. So we come together and we have produced reports, also manifesto asks that we have sent round to all the major parties as well. So that's some of the work that we do. And we are a very small organization, but we are looking at how we can be more effective at the national level, whether that's through more sustained lobbying around certain areas. And so we're currently going through that process at the moment of working out where we can be most effective and more effective at the national level, while continuing to do our work with the Blueprint Coalition and advocating for those changes with a broader coalition of partners. I will also say that the research report, one of the aims of that is to kind of show those national trends, but also to have asks basically of the different levels. So whether that's local communities, ask for local communities on ways to improve, whether that's ask for local councils on ways to improve, but also ask for the national governments on ways to improve as well. We have talked to different teams within the national government as well to kind of put across what we think is some of the key recommendations, whether that's a statutory duty on climate like there was for local authorities, the removal of the short-term competitive funding pots, which I think everyone in the sector agrees with should be just got rid of. And I think we'll continue to push on that as well. So yeah.
I mean, from Mobility Ways perspective, I was very interested in the fact that you sort of talk about a third of emissions are,
Yeah.
sort of within the direct council's control, be
Yeah.
it
Influence or
council.
powers. Yeah.
Yes. And obviously, Mobility Ways, we work with large organisations to help them themselves decarbonise with a
Yeah.
focus on commuting. I wondered within the scoring if there's any weighting that should be provided to the public sector as a whole within a council or a region. So the councils, the universities, the NHS, who are
Yeah.
all, think about NHS, think about councils, legally obligated to deliver net zero.
Yeah.
Where could perhaps that play a role to say, look, we're leading
Yeah.
by example, so that for the rest of our region,
Yeah.
we're effectively becoming the ambassador.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's key. I think that's so key to do. Not only because one of the key things that comes out of any transport policies is, oh, you're just trying to enforce this on us, you don't want to do it yourselves. And yet if the council, the local authority, the public services turn around and go, we are leaning on this, we are transitioning to EVs, we are moving towards it, it's so much easier to go, this is why we're putting in place policies. But I think it's important why we focus on councils and not other areas the public sector is because obviously councils being democratically accountable, but they have wider powers than just their own corporate emissions. They have powers over where bike lanes or bus lanes go. They have powers over things like that affect policy that affects the way we interact with our environment is partly down to the policies that councils enforce. Even things like, for example, in our planning section, this is very transport related. Lots of councils still have minimum parking standards across their areas, which is just something that enforces like a car-centric society, because you're enforcing the minimum parking standards, which is a huge waste of land as well, and developers don't like it either. And it's those kind of things, that policies that shape the design of communities, that actually, if they were to be changed, would shape the design of communities for a more environment friendly and positive area, and kind of create the low carbon communities that we need. I think that things like the areas like the NHS, the prison service, and other big public sector organisations are key to also be leading on this. And I know the NHS is starting to do some more work, particularly around energy for their hospitals and things like that. That councils in particular, because of those extra powers, I think are key to be seen as leaders. And if they are, I think people really respond to that positively as well. I think people really want councils to be taking climate action in their local area. And then when councils come forward with different initiatives, I think it's so much easier if they go, well, look, we're using EVs. Like, we just want you guys to, the community to use them more as well. Like, we know they work. It's okay, kind of thing.
So looking ahead, I guess, to 2025 and another assessment of this, what
Yeah,
are you hoping to see by way of improvement, particularly where transport's concerned? And
yeah.
how I guess, I mean, you've alluded a little bit in the presentation, but where's the best bets really for a council to increase their score?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me it would be around so bus decarbonisation. That would be really encouraging to see more electric buses on the roads, but also electric buses which are being trialled in areas which are semi-urban, rural, even rural areas. Because at the moment it's dominated by some of the key hubs like Greater Manchester or London, where they are. I think the other thing for me, it's one of the initiatives that is really close to my heart. It doesn't necessarily have, although a good school streets program would be effective, but it's the number of school streets. I think they can be so effective in every single urban area, from really small areas up to really major cities. Um, and I think that it would be really encouraging if more areas follow Somerset's lead, which is based classified as like a urban, semi-urban rural authority. If they were to actually follow that lead, and you could see school streets in more places, like across Devon, across Norfolk, in some of our other major market towns as well, and also in shared mobility. I think that having things like car clubs, in car sharing schemes, giving back, kind of that giving back to communities, in the sense that, okay, public transport might take a little while to get better in this country without extra funding, without extra commitment, and that's very difficult. But things like car sharing schemes, they can be profitable, they can be viable. There are companies that are willing to go into different areas and supply those. And so it doesn't have to be just completely funded by essentially the public sector. Um, that councils can play a real leading role in encouraging those car clubs, car sharing schemes to come to the area. They can also, provide priority parking areas for those car sharing schemes, so that again, it's another incentive around parking as well. And I think it's those kind of shared mobility schemes, which means that anyone can access up a kind of a public transport system, but just in lots of different ways, as well as initiatives like school streets and decarbonisation of buses, which would be really encouraging. But across the board, there just needs to be more action from councils in general on transport, whether that's from even decarbonising their council fleet.
Well, a small plug for Mobility Ways. Obviously, part
Yeah,
of our offering is lift
yeah,
share. That's
yeah, of
actually
course.
using cars that exist and supporting individuals with cost of living, making it
Yeah,
easier
yeah,
for people to travel to work and the like. 700,000 members. We'd love that to be 7 million. I think if we could get a real national impetus towards lift sharing, I think it will be fantastic. I
yeah,
mean, and we do have a couple of more minutes. There are a couple of questions. One about, actually, you talked about school streets.
yeah,
Actually, I think it was Lois Chandler, I believe, was the question coming through. I'm saying there was a lot of will from the council, but there's actually tried repeatedly to get school streets in, but schools have are not so keen to do it,
yeah,
which is I'm wondering why, and what needs to be done there. Whereas,
yeah,
I guess an interesting thing for me is, like, how do we make sure that all of the fantastic success stories and best practice that you're seeing is shared
yeah.
across all councils?
Yeah, exactly. And part of that is you can find that on the scorecards website as well, because obviously you'll see councils that have scored highly in those particular areas, and then can click through, because we provide the evidence links, and then maybe contact those councils. We know councils have done that using the scorecards results to go through and contact other councils to see how and why things worked. Yeah, that's a definite issue that certain communities may not like. I think one of the key things is to have is to suggest some of these schemes on a trial basis. I think that gives people a decision that, oh, it's not just something that you're going to make, but it's something that we've kind of can make the decision together. I think that's something that's been really successful for lots of different transport initiatives. I think the other thing is that, and I've seen this in transport, I've seen this in initiatives, even when I lived in Vancouver for a little bit. Unfortunately, like, people sometimes will not believe that those co-benefits will come through and that the negative effects aren't going to be disastrous until the scheme is in place. They will not, they will continue to think, people will continue to think, for example, that, you know, traffic will just be pushed onto other roads, despite the fact that in places like New York, when they shut down the main avenues and made it bus only, the traffic displacement didn't happen because of traffic evaporation, which is another well-studied initiative. That's the same for when Oxford closed its city centre, or the congestion charge, for example. What we see is not traffic displacement, but traffic evaporation. That is something that's, I don't think, breaks into public consciousness very often and isn't portrayed, for example, in the media. But one thing that is really encouraging, there was a huge furore, obviously, around low traffic neighborhoods, and when they were introduced kind of during the kind of COVID period in this country, the majority of those low traffic neighborhoods are in place and are still in place. And so it kind of shows that once those schemes are in place, that people adapt, people realize, you know, that the negative effects that they thought might happen maybe don't happen, and the positive effects actually outweigh maybe if there aren't any negative effects. That's not to say that every scheme is perfect, but I think one of the key things is that if you get a scheme in, particularly as a trial, so that people feel like they can make the decision as a community together, and hopefully you can overcome some of that opposition. But I'm not going to sit here and say that it's not hard, because I've seen people fighting against bike lanes that are only a mile away from the most successful bike lane in North America. And the community was like, oh, it's bad for business. It's bad for people won't cycle. And even though 1 mile down the road, there was the most heavily used bike lane, the business district had come out and said, actually, it's not affected us at all. There hadn't been an increase in traffic because more people had cycled and used it. So I think that it can be a street by street fight in that sense. But one of the key things that can overcome that is by getting those trials in place and showing the benefits and showing that it works in your local area. And then more people are going to be more encouraged to do it. But it's all about getting those first schemes in.
Fabulous. Right. Well, I think we're close to time. Thank you ever so much, Isaac. It's been,
No worries.
been fascinating, hopefully useful for registrants. For now, best wishes to all for the upcoming festive period. And I sincerely hope that we continue this conversation in 2024. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.